There we are. Okay. Welcome to the latest episode of the Red Pilled Fiction Factory. I apologize for the long delay. It's been very busy at my end. Luckily, Corporate Clark stepped in a few weeks ago and did a great interview with R.J. Smith to fill in the gaps. Another of the reasons why I wasn't able to get this particular interview today, today's interview scheduled is because the guest in today, whose name is Michael Harris or M. Anthony Harris, depending on which name he's using on his book or not, lives in the middle of China, and it's been very difficult to coordinate with him a time where we're both free to talk. Not least, he's about 15 hours ahead. We've had guests from the Hawaiian Islands and New Zealand before, but I think you qualify Michael as the most remote guest to appear on the show. How are you? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing pretty good. I'm glad to be your furthest away guest.
You live not just in China, but in like the remotest part of China. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, I live in a part of China where I talk to other Chinese people when I'm traveling, and they're like, "Oh, that place? I've never heard of it."
What's it called? I daren't pronounce it myself. I know I'll make a mess.
I live in Qinghai province, and it's just north of Tibet, and the city I live in is called Xining.
Is that right? And are you basically one of the very few Westerners there?
Yeah, the city I'm in is the capital of Qinghai, and it's about 2 million people, but there's only about 200 foreigners in this city. So, yeah, one of the few of them out here.
Yeah. Now, this all is in stark contrast to your background. You're from Colorado, which is...
Yep. So the scenery isn't much different because it's a lot of grasslands and mountains in Qinghai.
Right. It's very remote, very empty, isn't it? But from what I've just seen on the internet.
Yep.
It's a very empty place. So, all right, let's go back in time. Were you born in Colorado or you just grew up there?
Just grew up there. I was born in Virginia, but spent a few years in a few different places and lived in Germany when I was a wee lad, and then grew up in Colorado for the most part.
Are you an army brat? Is that?
I was an army brat until I was like 7 or 8. After living in Colorado for a while, the army was like basically said to my dad, "Hey, you got to deploy to Panama," and he was like, "No, I like Colorado. I'm quitting the army." Right. So he had done his time.
And so, how did you get from Colorado all the way to Qinghai or Qingjing or wherever it is?
Yeah. Qinghai.
How did that happen?
Plane. No.
Okay, but it's before. I mean,
no. Basically, like, I'd always liked Asia, and I had some friends in China, and my brother, he had been to Qinghai like 6 or 7 years before I moved here, and he really liked it. And so he was like, it's kind of the Colorado of China. And so when I decided to come to China, it was a choice between here and a place called Harbin, which is famous for being one of the coldest cities in all of China. It gets like minus 40, basically every winter it's minus 40 up there. So it gets cold here in Qinghai, but it's usually not nearly that cold. So this is better.
And what took your brother there? English language teaching, or?
He came for a missions trip, like with a church group. So he was there and was working with some college kids, and he was here for 2 weeks.
And that's what you did too. Is that why you went, with a missionary or position, or it was the? I shouldn't say missionary position. That's not right. But it was a mission.
No. Not really. For me, I just kind of wanted to move to Asia, and like I am a Christian, so I think my philosophy is just wherever you are, you're a missionary, like even if it's your hometown.
Right.
So I didn't go with any organization or anything. So it was just like I'm gonna move to China, see how I like it, move for a couple months, and then a couple months ended up being almost 11 years now.
11 years. And in that time, you've met a Chinese girl, I understand, and married?
Yes. Yeah, met a nice Chinese gal. She's from Yunnan province, and we just had our son our first kid a couple months ago.
Oh, congratulations.
So he's in the room crying because he doesn't want to go to sleep right now. But
Right. And what do you do day to day in your life there?
right now I'm teaching at an international school here, and when I'm not teaching, obviously I'm writing because that's why I'm on here. But yeah, I'm teaching fourth grade at an international school here.
Okay. And what's this about a coffee shop or a milk tea shop that I read on the internet?
I forgot to update that. Yeah, I had for a year or two, we had a little milk tea shop. Me and my wife, we ran a milk tea shop, just the two of us. And yeah, sadly we had to close it down, but we're hoping we can reopen it in a new location in a year or two once the little dude is not so little.
Right. But you're planning to stay in China. That's the goal, is it? That's your game plan at the
Yeah,
moment.
we'll see where God leads us, but for now it's China.
Interesting. How do they treat you there? Are you a bit of an exotic specimen?
Yeah. You get used to like one of the first words you learn in China as Waiguoren, like foreigner,
Yeah.
because just walking down the street and people are like Waiguoren. Oh, Kanagalawai. Like, look at that foreigner. Look at that. So you get that all the time. So
And
it's
you're
mostly fine. Sometimes it gets annoying after like the 1,000th time, but most of the time it's okay.
but you're fluent in Chinese now and able to integrate and sort of make your way.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm fluent, but I'm conversational. My
Right.
reading sucks though.
Well, good for you for doing all that. Now, in your brief bios that I found on the internet, it says that you live in the mountains of the Tibetan Plateau, chasing the dream of becoming king of the Yetis. Is this Yeti territory where you are?
Uh, pretty
Sort of.
much.
Yeah.
It's in
Uh,
Chinese. It's the Yuanren, so it's more Yuanren territory
what's
than
you?
Yeti territory.
What's that?
So in Chinese, there's like Yeti is like Tibet and Nepal. Yeren is kind of like a wild man, more like humanoid, and Yuanren is kind of like the Bigfoot. So
Okay.
yeah, I'm a little bit of a cryptozoology nerd. So
Very good. It says also that since you were a child, you've been regaling your siblings with thrilling tales of adventure. When he's not writing, you can find him practicing kung fu, drawing, painting, and honing his Mandarin skills by chatting in Chinese with whoever dares to talk to the strange Lao Wai. I imagine that's how you say it. We're going to discuss. You've written for amongst my guests, you're one of the most prolific writers. It's very unusual for anyone I interview to have written more than one book, to be honest. It's quite unusual. You've written how many? About 7 or 8 or?
Written like 10 or 11, published. Let's see. I just published my 7th book a couple months ago. Or not,
Okay.
no, last month.
Right. Which is impressive. As I say, and unusual. Now, the book we're going to discuss, I think, is your first. Is it your first novel, Sleeper Agent?
Yeah, that was my first one.
Okay, it's a novella, to be more precise. It features a character called Stephen Matthews, who's a college student in electrical engineering who has unusually lucid dreams. And the title Sleeper Agent is a very clever one, because it incorporates at least two meanings. And it's based loosely, I imagine, on the US Army's or military's attempts to harness psychic abilities, which we sort of hear about every now and then in a weird headline, but no one's really looked into it. Most of us have never really looked into it too deeply because it seems so bizarre, but we do know it happens. And it's ongoing for sure, and anyone who can crack this psychic ability obviously would be arming himself with a very powerful weapon. And funnily enough, no sooner had I finished the book, but I started seeing headlines that companies in AI and the sort of internet type companies are now paying people for the work that they do in their sleep, which is exactly what you were describing in the book. Sleeper Agent is this character has lucid dreams. He gets incorporated into the US military machine, if you like, industrial complex, and for his abilities to dream. And here we are in the real world. We see an exact parallel. Anyway, please would you explain the plot line and how it starts and evolves from your perspective, because you're better at it than I am.
Okay. I think you did a pretty good job. It almost sounds like a better summary than I could give. But yeah, the story is about a guy named Stephen Matthews, and he's a graduate student. I forgot. I believe so. Yeah, a graduate student in electrical engineering, and basically he gets recruited by this research institute that's secretly part of ongoing MK Ultra related programs, and they recruit him because of his dreams, which aren't quite dreams. He basically has the ability to see through the eyes of people who are awake when he's sleeping. So he's like when he's sleeping instead of dreaming, he could see through the eyes of somebody else who is awake. And like after he gets recruited by the research institute, they teach him how to hone those skills, and he basically stumbles onto a terrorist plot and gets kidnapped and has to fight his way out.
Yeah, it's very clever. His dreams segue into reality. That's the whole, and in and out of reality. He back and forth throughout the novel. So it's very cleverly construed. And although he's asleep for quite a lot of the book, his dreams are very, very action-packed. So it's a kind of contrast there, where physically he may be dormant, lying on a bed in a lab, but his imagination and his dreams are set in the real world, if you like. And great action scenes. You say you practice a bit of kung fu. Was that for the sake of the bio to make it look interesting, or you actually do practice kung fu?
I practice. There's a style called sanda, which is Chinese kickboxing. If you've ever seen Muay Thai, it's kind of like Muay Thai but without the elbows.
Okay, so you do have experience, because it comes across that the action-packed scenes are very action-packed and work very well. Is it the sort of place where you live where they still have monasteries of kung fu, like that we sort of used to watch in films and stuff, or is that all something out of Hollywood?
Yes and yes. Yes to both. So like most people in China, like even though I would call myself a skilled beginner, I'm better than like martial arts than most people in China you'd run into. But I know like 2 or 3 people who are legit like masters of their craft. So I was able to study for a while under a guy. He was the champion of all of China for the Chinese wrestling called Shuaijiao. So he's like 5'3", something like that. And I think he's almost 70 now. But when I was training with him, he was like 65. But like I'm 200 pounds and he was like 145, something like that. And he was just ragdolling me.
Yeah, yeah.
So
and is the cliche of them being very humble and living very sort of humble lives in saffron robes or whatever true, or is it, or do they live normal lives? And
yeah, that guy, he was just a nice grandpa who practices kung fu in the park, and who does like, I don't know exactly how to describe it, but there's like a Chinese dance they have. It's not the dragon dance that you see in like the movies, but they have like a dragon ribbon on a string, and he does that in the park a lot. So
okay,
just like a nice grandpa who can throw you around like nobody's business, basically.
yeah. So what were your inspirations for picking up pen and paper? Was it because you were suddenly found yourself in the middle of China with few people to talk to, I imagine, for a few years? Was that one of the motivations, or had it always been a thing to you to put pen to paper and create stories?
The creating stories has always been a thing to me, but for putting pen to paper, I had an idea. Like I said in my bio, I like painting and drawing, but I don't have the patience to do it like full time and like dedicate myself to it. So I had an idea for a graphic novel, and I wanted to draw like the graphic novel myself, but my skills didn't match what the story in my head demanded. So I was just like, oh, I always told stories, I'll just write it as a book.
Right.
And I never finished that book, but I've written something like 11, 12 books since starting that book that I
And that's
never went back.
That's quite recent. Sleeper Agent came out in 2017, so you've been doing that a book every 6 months basically since then, have you?
I would say, well, I haven't counted, so that might be.
It's about that. Were you inspired by any particular writers or genres? Because you cover quite a few genres. I mean, one of them is at least one of them is called Sherlock Hamster, which is for children, obviously. Several are thrillers. One or two look like sort of young adult love story type things. Is there a genre you see yourself affiliated with, or are you just a jack of all trades in that sense?
I'm a fantasy writer at heart, and that's like my favorite genre, but I would say I'm a little more of a jack of all trades, if that makes sense. Like, I'm a fantasy writer who writes other genres, is probably how I would describe it.
Were you inspired by certain writers? Is your style influenced by? Do you have any heroes in the field?
Obviously, Tolkien is a hero of mine, but like writing wise, I wouldn't say I write like him though. I also really enjoy Brandon Sanderson's work, and Robin Hobb. I don't know if you've heard of either of them.
I don't know them, but I'm sure other listeners will.
Yeah, they're kind of fantasy. They're fantasy heavyweights, is how I describe them.
Right.
As far as like thrillers, I like Clive Cussler.
Yeah.
Yeah, Clive Cussler was probably my main go-to for thrillers. Him and a Christian author called Ted Dekker.
Okay. And let's come on to your Christianity is obviously very important to you. In Sleeper Agent, at least, it didn't come across particularly. I don't think. But would you just give us an idea of the role it plays in your writing process, or if it plays a role at all?
Like some of them, for one of my stories, one called Terminal, that one, I had an idea and I felt like God was like, you should write this story. It's not explicitly Christian, but it's set in a world where people who get superpowers, their bodies can't handle it. So it's basically like getting terminal cancer, because it eats away at their bodies to power itself. So it's like about a teenage kid who's, just the girl he's been in love with for a couple years finally said yes to go out with him, and then he finds out he has superpowers and he has to learn how to live with dying. So like that one, I kind of felt God telling me, this is a story you need to write, you need to get out there. But with my writing, like with Christianity in my writing, I kind of view it more the Tolkien-esque style of it's implicit in the story, not explicit, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
and your Christianity, does that help formulate your political views as well? Obviously the show is a red-pilled show, and the writers we featured do not come from the woke new left crowd. Where do you see yourself sort of sitting in that respect?
Yeah, it definitely influences my political views. So I grew up conservative, and as I grew up conservative, became libertarian, and then kind of became conservatarian. And yeah, living in China kind of made me, I don't know, some of the people in the watching might not like this, but living in China kind of made me a little bit anti-libertarian. I still have some of those tendencies, but in some ways I kind of see it as like the right's mirror of communism. Like it's kind of a utopianist vision, and I'm like, people are kind of fallen, so it would be nice if we could have that, if we could be completely libertarian, but I don't think it works practically.
I think that's a very common view on libertarianism, especially as the older you get. It's a great gateway for younger people to enter the non-left, because to leave, you have to leave the left on purpose.
Yeah.
You're born into it, whether you like it or not. So, and there are a few paths that are allowed out of it, which even vaguely respectable, if you like, to the average person. So libertarianism does serve a great purpose, but I think most people who follow that track find it leads on to other places. And of course, you're in a very interesting place in the middle of China to see that, well, a side of politics that few of us have ever come close to experiencing. I mean, we may have read about it or heard about it, but you're living it. So I'm happy to bow to your knowledge in that respect. You wrote a sequel to Sleeper Agent. Would you give us? I haven't read it. It's called Cold War. Can you?
Yep.
But I am intrigued because I really like the plot line and the concept of Sleeper Agent. So I'm wondering what happens. Does Stephen Matthews continue as the character in that one, or is it a different?
Yeah, so far I've only written 2, but I plan, and I have a couple other stories I'm writing. But I plan on returning to the Sleeper Agent world in the future. But with Sleeper Agent Cold War, it picks up a couple months after the first one left off, and they're looking for the bad guy from the first one. And there's I don't know if you heard about it, but in real life there's a town in Kazakhstan, just a small town in Kazakhstan called Kalachi, and there was a strange illness there for a couple years where people would just fall into comas randomly for weeks at a time, months at a time. And so
I haven't heard of that. Go on.
yeah. So I use that for inspiration for the story, and I actually had a couple Kazakh friends here in China for a while. Most of them went back to Kazakhstan, but I consulted with a couple of them, and they clued me into a lot of cool history there. And they were saying, "Oh yeah, the Soviets had, an experimental base close to that area, and they conducted a lot of secret experiments." So I was like, "That's awesome. I'm gonna put that in my book."
And
So
so the plot follows the same sort of trajectory as the previous one. It's about dreams blurring and merging with reality.
yes.
Yeah.
So basically, like I tied in the mysterious sleeping sickness because it stopped, and then but in the story, basically it starts re-emerging again, and they realize that it's tied to the bad guy who, maybe spoiler alert, but he has the same abilities as Steven.
Right. Okay. What other books are you working on? Obviously your brain works much more rapidly than most of us. Maybe you've learned to write in your sleep, like Stephen. But at the rate you're going, there'll be another 50 or 60 books by the time you quit writing. What are you looking at? Yeah. Do you have a particular focus from here, or are you just going to keep this sort of scattergun approach on all different types of book?
Yeah, I'm just gonna keep writing whatever story pops into my head. So I have two I started and I should finish, but I also started another book that I did finish between those two I started. And
Right.
then literally just yesterday, I started a new book because I've had an idea brewing in my head for a couple months, and I finally got the story for the setting in my head, if that makes sense.
Amazing. I envy you. I enjoy the writing process, but I find coming up with a plot is almost an impossibility. And so I'm
Uh,
grateful for one or two every
I
decade.
Yeah, I am very much a pantser, so I just kind of come up with an idea and then see what happens.
And of
So
course, well, now you've had a child born recently, of course, that will start interfering with your
yeah,
writing routine, you'll find. You'll
yeah,
have to
it's
feed your...
definitely now.
Pardon me, Ace, what?
I said my output is slower now that I got a
Yeah,
baby. But
yeah.
yeah, you were asking though what I'm working on, so my hopefully in a couple months I'm gonna put out a new book. This will be also aimed more towards kids, like kind of like tweens, but it's I call it a fantastical adventure story. So it's about a kid who is in this strange world where fogs are sentient giant walking creatures, and there's things like lobodiles, which are giant lobster crocodiles, and centibears, which are centipede bears. So bunch of strange dangers, and he gets picked up by a storm, thrown halfway across the continent, and loses his memories and has to find his way home through dangers of monsters like centibears, shark buffaloes, and also landscape that moves. Like there's the wandering plains, which are nomadic grasslands that just wander around the landscape. So it's kind of out there and fantastical, but it's fun. And I kind of want to show kids that I wanted to write a story that was not, end of the world, just kind of a personal adventure story, but I wanted it to be fun and fantastical.
Sounds a bit like a Roald Dahl derived story?
Yeah, I've actually never read any of his stuff, but
Okay.
it could be.
Yeah, yeah. So you're in the middle of China. Do you go back to the United States or visit the West much, or is it too big a journey to take off?
Yes and yes. Now with the baby and all that, and with COVID. So I used to go every year, but since COVID, I haven't been back because, like, at first China was closed, and since my life is here and my wife is here, I wouldn't have been able to come back uh, with all that craziness. And right now, it's still kind of hard to travel back to America, especially now with the little one.
Well, that gives us a great opportunity. Without being specific, and please don't mention treatments for this illness that everyone had around the world all of a sudden. I'm sure we have similar thoughts on it, but because we'll get banned if we talk about it too directly. But you were there in the middle of this in real China, not the sort of the China presented to the West during the beginning of COVID then. And was it, I mean, were people dropping dead in the streets around you and so on? Or how would you describe a little bit? Because this is a unique insight. No one I know has seen it the way you saw it.
Yeah, not really. Like, it was just draconian lockdowns, and I know people died, and like I saw videos of people dropping like a couple months before like it became a thing, like I think in November 2019. Like I heard of a mysterious illness and saw some videos of that, but it wasn't like a big deal. The only time that it was kind of like that was after, after, I don't know if you heard of like the riots and whatnot they had to end the lockdowns, but the only
Really?
time it was. Oh, sorry.
Okay. I didn't know there were riots to end the lockdowns. I knew there was dissatisfaction, but that probably wasn't covered in the West too much.
Yeah, there was a bunch of riots. I didn't see them personally, but like even like just a city or two over, people were like attacking the police, and thousands of people were just tearing down barriers, tearing down all the COVID testing stations.
Yeah.
So
Oh. Were the lockdowns enforced and obeyed, or was there a sort of a sort of, I live in Mexico, a sort of third world lackadaisicity about it, where people just basically went on with their own life while pretending, if you like, to obey, or was it very strict indeed?
yeah, it was very strict. Like it kind of depends. Like in the summers, it was more lackadaisical, but as the weather got colder and COVID came more and more, because it's cold weather sickness basically.
Yeah.
Like, and it got pretty draconian. Like right before like things finally stopped because of all the riots and whatnot. There was a point where they would only let you out like for a couple hours in the day, and you could only go to certain shops, and they had like all the grocery stores had all their food outside, and they sprayed down everything. And yeah, I had to get black market water. So
Is that right?
yep, there was a little shop near my old place, because I've moved since then. I'm still in the same city, but at a different complex. But yeah, there was a little shop, and basically they had a spotter who kept an eye out for like the officials, and when the officials weren't looking, you would sneak in and get snacks and get water.
Okay, well, this segues well into the only other thing we keep hearing from China nowadays, is the sort of sequel to lockdowns, which is a CBDC type. Well, you have a social credit score, let's call it that. And if you're not up to scratch on your social credit score, you get punished. You're not allowed on a train, or you've got to buy inferior products or something like that. I do hear a lot of people say it's just for the West. It's again a bit like the COVID thing, that it's more of a projection onto the West, trying to get us to condition our minds to accept these things because the Chinese are doing it and it's sort of inevitable and it's the future and blah blah blah. But I've also heard a lot of people say it's nonsense, and they live in China and visited China and they've no experience whatsoever of this kind of thing. It may be regional for all I know, but it is a huge country after all. Have you experienced anything along those lines, where photos being taken when you go to the shops and then you can only buy this or buy that, or anything like that?
No, I haven't experienced that. Like, the closest I've seen is there's a couple streets here in my city. Like, if you jaywalk, they have a camera that shows your face on a big screen.
Right.
So that's the closest in my city. But basically, from like, I've mostly lived in the west of China, like northwest of China. I've traveled a bit around, but what I tell people who ask about these things is everything you hear about China is true in a part of China.
Right. That's very sensible. Yeah. It is a huge country.
I said it's pretty regional.
Yeah. Do you take advantage of your position to sort of visit Mongolia, Nepal, Tibet, places like this, or?
I haven't visited Tibet because where I live, Qinghai is basically part of Old Tibet. So if you go into actual Tibet as a foreigner, you have to be with you have to be with a tour group, and it's just kind of a pain in the butt. But you just go a couple hours outside my city and you're in Tibetan areas. And I have a bunch of friends who are like Tibetan, or even a lot who are nomads. So for me, I'm like, I have Tibet where I live, so I'm not going to bother traveling to there. But yeah, I've been to Mongolia, outer Mongolia. I haven't been to inner Mongolia yet, even though it's right next to me. Yeah.
You camp in a yurt or in these things, or is it all very sort of normal Western hotels? And
Ulaanbaatar was really fascinating because, like, I did go to a national park and camp in a yurt there, but like in the city of Ulaanbaatar itself, you'll see a high-rise building with a mall at the bottom, and literally across the street is a yurt, and across from the yurt is a Buddhist temple.
Right.
So pretty fascinating place. I really liked Ulaanbaatar. I would love to go again.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating region. It's one of the few sort of really unexplored, by Western standards at least, regions left on the planet, I imagine. Wow, very interesting. And when you look at the West today, you're quite happy to be ensconced in the middle of China. The West is not going through its finest hour at the moment. What are your views? Because you have a fairly unique perspective again on what's going on. How do you see it all? And how do you see it progressing?
I think, like, might sound a little bit conspiracy theory-ish, but I think a lot of the powers that are behind the powers, they use China as kind of a testing ground, and America's basically China's, but like 10 years behind with the leftist policies. So, like, a lot of the things I see in China, America adopts like 5-6 years later. So there's good and bad, but mostly with the American left, it's all the bad stuff that they're adopting.
China obviously is a bit of an enigma. It's a cliche, but and they're communist and they're capitalist and they're this and that, but they have undeniably progressed economically and standard of living wise unbelievably fast, incredibly fast. In decades they've achieved what the West took centuries to achieve. And yes, it's this there's an element of dictatorship in it and so on, but they haven't introduced the sort of the degeneracy and the really sad looking. I mean, the last week alone in America, we've had people doing unspeakable things in Congress or whatever it is. We've had a statue of Satan erected in some other state house, and you know, for better or for worse, the Chinese seem to have steered a much better path in that respect compared to the West. So, in a way, I'm heartened when you say China's the role model for the West 10 or 20 years now, because it would be a much better West than the one that's the trajectory we're on at the moment. I'm not saying I want that at all. I like the old West, and I'd bring it back in a heartbeat if I could. But if it's a choice between Chinese future and sort of Western liberal lefty future, amazingly, I would find myself volunteering for China. What do you put the difference down to? I mean, they're both ostensibly left-wing regimes, you know, and left-wing philosophies. Is it a Confucian thing? Is it a sort of ethnic thing? How do you distinguish?
Ooh, that is not an easy question to answer. I think it's a little bit of Confucianism, a little bit of just kind of China is, I think it's traditional, like it, you know, even though like Mao, he had the Sijiu, like the four olds that he tried to tear down, they still, even despite all that, like it's still very traditional. I also think, like, as a Christian, I think there's like a concerted like spiritual attack on the West, like trying to tear people's sexual identity and make them only like view themselves as their sexual identity or their minority identity. And so I think it's kind of a mixture of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But the long and short of it is, you're not missing life in the West at the moment. You're quite happy where you are, I imagine.
I miss some things. I miss good pizza, lasagna, things like that. And I miss my family in the West, but
sure.
Like when I don't miss the politics. Like it sucks watching all that stuff happen from here.
Yeah. Well, very interesting, fascinating, and I'm very glad we got you on. And I thank you again for being a guest, Michael, Anthony, whichever name it's, because the books are published under M. Anthony Harris, but your name is Michael. Thank you for being a guest on the show, and please keep churning out the books. We look forward to more. I think they're very filmic, so I think there's a chance one day you'll get one of these made into a film. We'll see. Anyway, much appreciated. Good to have you on. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.